Thank you, Siwa. Thank you for being here on a Friday night. It's really surreal to be on Alcoff Bridge. I've been so immersed in the world of Pasita for what feels like a decade, and it's that feeling, when you actually step on the real thing that you have thought about for so long. So I'm really grateful to you, Siwa and Nat, and I'm really honored to meet you and be in conversation with you, Lisa. It's my first time in Singapore, and it's also my first time in Asia in general. I grew up in kind of the middle of nowhere, in the Mojave Desert in California. So it's of course it would take someone like Pasita, who is so world-loving and globe-trotting, to bring me back closer to home for the first time. But she brought me to the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis in the Midwest of the United States in 2021. And that's where I worked with the curator, Vicky Sung, who is there in the amazing underwater wilderness Pasita shirt in orange, and the Abad family on her first major retrospective. And I'm giddy to dive in, to use a Pasita. I have like built-in jokes and laughter, but you'll know what I mean by dive in when Lisa gets into her Underwater Wilderness series. But to dive into a small but really meaningful body of work that was made here at STPI, but had a very humble presence in the showing at the Walker. So among these works, one really lingers in my mind, and that's a self-portrait made during her 2003 residency here, which absolutely baffled me. Abad's final self-portrait was also her most abstract. One can imagine a triangular head and dots clustered toward the center, which suggests an all-seeing eye, and foil-backed holes recall Rajasthani shisha mirror embroidery. And curved rick-rack ribbon-like legs move from the torso to a ground of orange and purple, lined by cowrie shell. There's splattered paint, floral print, and printed faux batik gathered into a body. And its many patterns and shapes suggest the pounds of fabric she collected, altered, and wore over her life's sojourn through over 60 countries. And Abad, in this time, rarely published poems. So then why was she so moved to keep this one? And the lines read, quote, "Oh my baby, oh my girl, oh sweet baby," read like a ditty or an elegy. Pain and joy mirror the dual jubilance and woe of the tears streaming to meet her smile. The poem's opening lines anticipate two major series of abstractions that are here before you. It's kind of silly to show this slide of the gallery when we're here in the gallery. So please feast your eyes on the work itself. But there's two works here. There's Endless Blues and Circles in My Mind that are brought together in space in this show, Common Ground. And Endless Blues was born out of her lifelong love of the blues genre as a musical genre, and conceived in the wake of the 9/11 attacks and her devastating diagnosis of lung cancer. And the repeated O in the folk reads like a folk song or an incantation or a dirge, and like an utterance into form. And it prefigures the elemental shape that she would explore expansively in this series here, Circles in My Mind. An ecstatic eruption of color and texture birthed at STPI, and a series so ebullient that it's easy to forget how much of it was forged amid illness and antidote. With Endless Blues, Abad crossed into abstraction, exploring the color blue as both hue and tone, pigment and pulse, and whether it was the ultramarine and electric blue of her Chapunto paintings or the syncopated rhythm of her jazz muses, Ray Charles, Etta James, Coco Taylor, Marvin Gaye, the blues was among her earliest sources of freedom. And in a work called Make Love Not War, which I believe is in this gallery over here, dots of indigo, mint, mango, crimson, and cotton candy pink gather like bodies in a plaza, spiraling like light scattered through a psychedelic haze. And the title, Make Love Not War, recalls the anti-war protests of San Francisco's Summer of Love, close to where I live now. Abad first made a home in San Francisco after fleeing political retaliation from the Marcoses. And she arrived in the mid-'70s amongst the pulse of counterculture frequenting a place called Miniscandu, which is pictured here, just right at the end of this horizon. And it was a black-owned bar in a historic part of San Francisco called Black Fillmore. And it was run by a sassy woman named Miss Minnie Carrington, and she was remembered as a, quote, and the place was remembered as a, quote, safe haven of feel-good bohemian hipness. And it was one of the many spaces that nourished the creative communities of color Abad gravitated toward. She had a keen intuition for local watering holes where femmes and baddies gathered amid the legendary beatniks and musicians of the Haight-Ashbury scene. So jazz and blues attuned her rhythm and improvisation, situating her within a distinctly American moment of hot, cross-cultural exchange and blissful utopian aspiration. And immersed in that world, she began the aesthetic awakening that would sustain her creative drive for a lifetime. And at STPI, Abad returned to paper for the first time in nearly a decade, revisiting a medium that had always represented freedom in her practice. So in this work, Korean toothpicks, gold-tinted wrappers form the ground for rough-edged layers of pink and peach pulped paper, bands of what appear to be shredded photographs of her own work. Earlier in her career, she recalled a story where she was experimenting with whatever was on hand. And while waiting for a friend at a restaurant, she remembered, I started collecting the paper-wrapped toothpicks on all the tables, and with each of them, I pasted it in my sketch pad, and after gluing, I applied gold paint and began sketching on fillboard, blotting, cardboard, cigarette packs, rice, banana, which I don't know how you do this with banana, road maps, newsprints, to name a few. And for Abad, paper's mutability mirrored her own restless spirit. And she said, it gives you an unlimited freedom to express yourself. So the dot motifs that recur throughout her work echo the visual grammar of Aboriginal painting, like the painted clapsticks that she collected and held in her own house. They represented an ontological system of circles and lines and arcs through which dreaming stories, chikorpa, are depicted and made present. And for Abad, this was not imitation, but resonance, a recognition that mark making could itself be an act of ancestral and personal connection, a mapping of relations across land and self. And Abad was a very meticulous archivist of self. She kept exhaustive journals, sketchbooks, and diaries that captured inspiration and the mundane alike, from meetings, dinners, movie dates, grocery lists, prescriptions, recipes, flowers, figures, newspaper clippings, and fabric scraps that were, and their cutouts that were poetically arranged. And they were all bound in books embellished with batik and beyond. So the blues grounded her, but Endless Blues as a series also marked a profound turn inward. During the early 2000s, as she underwent, quote, chop and burn poison for 8 non-stop months of lung cancer treatment, she wrote of painting as her, quote, refuge and the blues as her best therapy. And the handwritten notes from this period, which was once tight and florid, were now unsteady and scrawled, and they bear witness to both corporeal pain and creative insistence. Her writing and her hand structured her sense of time, so to lose one's dexterity was in some sense to lose oneself. And in a planner dated December 2003, she confessed, quote, I couldn't even write my name. Then the circle offered her a pathway back into aesthetic exploration despite increasing disability, a form she could return to again and again, carrying the discipline of endurance and contemplation, merging rhythm with the waning yet insistent strength of the body. And at STPI, this freedom expanded, joining a team of master artists, where she created over 56 works using a dizzying range of techniques and materials, from screen printing, lithography, linocut, mylar overlay, painting, assemblage, STPI's signature dyed handmade pulped paper, and as Basita does, she embeds buttons and glitters and sequins and old circuit boards. And though deceptively improvisational in look, each work was meticulously planned. There's a work called Sweet Dreams Were Made of These, playfully named after the Eurythmics discotheque banger, that required over 15 color plates alone. And that's on view, I think, in this gallery. And each layer interacted through elaborate stencils and their negative cutouts, and they were woven like fine lace. Nothing was wasted, one caption reads. So she later carried the method she developed at STPI into her final public project, Alcoff Bridge, which is really crazy to see it, gray. And she was determined to, in this photo, but she was determined to enliven its drab, quote, battleship gray surface. And she meticulously photographed it from every angle, studying its sensual curves, its tresses, and latticed architecture, noting how its structure framed the movements of those who crossed it. So she translated those observations into painted studies on large sheets of paper, worked horizontally on the floor like she did with her sprawling mural-sized trapuntos, and the studio wall became an evolving board pinned with references. Nearby, in the green, you can see a panel overlaid with trapezoidal paper pieces that recall Central African Kuba cloth applique. And her old CDs were always playing on a loop, and they filled the studio with sound, the roundness of their spinning forms, echoing the very motif she was preparing to spread across the bridge's steel frame. So to see these works now is to, in a sense, experience an orbital shift toward a flamboyant insistence of life. And despite the optimism that radiates from the Circles in My Mind series, an energy echoed by the Philippine and Singaporean presses, which heralded Pasita as, quote, triumphant, victorious, and unbreakable, it can be difficult to grasp that the depth of pain and the perseverance embedded in this creation. These works became the heart of her last show, Obsession, which traveled to the Cultural Center of the Philippines in 2004, where she described it as, quote, alone with my paints and brushes, music day and night is when I feel most relaxed. This is my therapy. This is my obsession, she said. In a photograph from the Obsession catalog, Abad sits surrounded by hundreds, perhaps thousands of painted, printed, and cut circles, smiling yet nearly subsumed by them. And the image recalls Japanese artist Yayoi Kusama's self-obliteration, in which the boundaries between self and object and environment melt. Kusama described her creative practice as a way of asserting her, quote, proof of living and overcoming of illness. On her use of repeated circular forms, she wrote, round, soft, colorful, senseless, and unknowing, polka dots can't stay alone, like the communicative life of people. 2 or 3 and more polka dots become movement. Polka dots are a way to infinity, and when we obliterate nature and our bodies with polka dots, we become part of the unity of our environment. We obliterate ourselves in love. And Abad, keenly aware of Kusama, approached this omnipresence with a different philosophical inflection, dissolving the self only to remake it anew. Both artists, through repetition and immersion, divulge a radical interdependence of matter and being. And together, the STPI works and the bridge mark a culmination in Abad's practice, a moment when decades of experimentation from sewing, stuffing, printing, applique, assemblage, pulping, burning, cutting, cohered into a single radiant syntax. The paper and the circle became instruments of release, but also of return, and they allowed her to revisit the improvisational instincts of her earliest bricolage while pushing them into newly ambitious, technical, and public form. The works rise from the surface, wrinkled, puckered, studded with foil and cowrie, heavy with pigment, carrying the same haptic flair as her trapunto painting, and in their layered density, she achieved a material and spiritual freedom, a coherence born from the regathering of the many lives that she had lived. And for Abad, the circle oriented these material freedoms to a philosophy of renewal. They carried the humor and abundance of daily life. Donuts, snails, windows, buns, bras. Broadly, as symbol and gesture and motion, they encompassed universe, mandala, portal, Om, the eye, Kalibutan, what art historian Patrick Flores expands on as the concentricity of world and consciousness. Layered in pulp and pigment, it suggests a body disintegrated and reconstituted. It is the atomization of self, the breaking apart of the body into color and rhythm. In the portrait, she resynthesizes herself with all the parts of her haptic, dimensional, and sensorial lives. Everything, everywhere, all at once. It is a portrait of all selves. To abstract oneself is not to disappear, but to proliferate. Circles reflect her last days, conjuring both willpower against illness and the vital endurance of a life evolving. Joy and pain mirror the twin rapture of melancholy, of the, quote, smile cracking through those streaked, beaded, and ever-rolling tears. Thank you. I'll hand it over to Lisa.
Thank you, Matthew, for that wonderful presentation, and it's great to be in dialogue with you. And I think our presentations are actually quite complementary, because Matthew has focused on the last few years of Pasita's artistic practice. But what I'll be presenting is actually on the first 10 years of her work. And you can see and also in how that carries over to the last few years of her practice. So this focus on the first 10 years of her work was also the subject of an exhibition that I guess curated for the Metropolitan Museum of Manila, which had opened last year. And first of all, I also would like to thank STPI for inviting me to talk today, and also the Pasita Abad Art Estate, notably Jack and Christy Garrity in Pio Abad, and the Metropolitan Museum of Manila, which had kindly invited me to curate this exhibition for them. Okay, just moving on. So this is just, okay, I realized I should have included more installation shots from this exhibition, but it gives you a sense of what the exhibition was like. So this is with the first section, which focuses on vivid colors. And really the focus of the show was also looking at her background of the Philippines in her work. If you're familiar with Pasita, she was really quite a peripatetic artist. She resided in 14 cities, traveled to over 16 countries, and even though she acknowledged the importance of travel that had on her work, she did say in an interview in 1985 that she'd rather be known as a Filipino painter wherever she is. And she did eventually become a United States citizen in 1994, but as soon as dual citizenship was possible, she was like the first in line to apply. And yes, she repeatedly referred to her background in the Philippines as a source of her work and attributing it to her love of nature and people as subjects of her art. So the exhibition really, focused on the first 10 years of her artistic practice from 1976, the time that she began her formal art studies at the Corcoran School of Art in Washington, to 1986. So this was the last year she was based in Manila after returning to the Philippines in 1982. So the exhibition really drew entirely from Philippine collections, and traced her growing confidence and motivations as a Philippine painter, active at home and overseas. So the first section looked at vivid colors, and then this is a quote from Pasita when she was interviewed in 1980, and she said, "I am a colorist more than anything else, and an expressionist." And the title of this section actually also refers to one of the very first articles that was written on Pasita. I think it was, let me just check on this. It was a Bangladesh, yes, it was in the Bangladesh Times. So the title of the article was Vivid Colors from 1978. So it was already something that people took notice of when she started exhibiting as an artist. Yeah, so this is a picture of Pasita with some of her early paintings in circa 1977. When she first started taking these art classes. So, I mean, one thing I really quite admire about Pasit, I mean, to think she wasn't intending to be an artist. And actually, her turn to art really shocked her family and friends. So much so that when they heard about it, they were like, "What do you mean?" Like they were just like, "What do you mean paintbrush?" They thought the only brush she's ever held is like hairbrush, toothbrush, right? It really like surprised them that she wanted to become an artist. But I think she really had the guts, you know, to go out there and try. And she actually referred to her time learning at Corcoran and stuff as a both frustrating and exhilarating experience. And it was frustrating because, you know, I think she had some difficulties, like in perspective. I mean, this is something that she acknowledged, but she absolutely delighted in color. And you can really see this in her early work. So this is one of her most ambitious paintings in the year that she had started, titled Batanes. So she did this when she was in Washington. And she was quite actually homesick when she had made this work. So at that time, she had already been based in the US for how many years? And she said, I quote, "Being away from home and my family, I was often nostalgic and homesick. Here I am in Washington, D.C., yet my thoughts were wandering back to the Philippines, dreaming of palm trees, sandy beaches, fields, and fishermen. While I was thinking of home, I came up with this composition entitled the painting Batanes, as that will always be my home." Yeah, so, I mean, even echoing over to like the end of her life, right? So I found out from Jack that her intention was she wanted to die in Batanes. So that was kind of the deal. And she had already like gone to the Philippines, she had an exhibition there at CCP, but apparently they had made a pact which was actually about pain, about managing her pain. And if the pain really got too much, and I think there was some difficulty accessing like certain medications back in Philippines. So that's why she returned to Singapore and she passed away over here. But it was absolutely her intent to go back home and to die there. You can see also, I mean, her use of color in this very large piece. And it's something that, I mean, it includes elements of Ibitan life, Batanes, but it's really more a composite of her ideas in the Philippines. So she worked on this painting for 3 months. Jack remembered they would be like dining and, you know, looking at this work, and they would be like discussing it. So it went through, I think, different rounds of composition as well. So she and Jack moved to New York in 1977, and she continued her studies at the Art Students League. And while there, she produced a series of really vibrant still life paintings, and it prompted her teacher, John Helliker, to ask her why her paintings were so colorful. And she is said to have replied to him with a smile, "These were the colors I grew up with. I come from a sunny country." So, and it's something that much later, I think when Sid Reyes interviewed her, she also repeated this kind of same sentiment, which was, she was saying that, you know, because by then she had, you know, traveled and exhibited in many parts of the world, and people would ask her, so, you know, what is Philippine about your work? And she said, confidence in color. Yeah, so when I see like even if the still life is not like particular Philippine scene, when I see her use of color, and you can also see it in these works in STPI, I think about also that kind of her background in the Philippines and how that influenced her. Yeah, so these very wonderful still life paintings. And I think it's quite interesting. It's like, even though it's like the subject, you know, very traditional still life, I don't think she's really actually exploring the still life, you know, object. It's like she's more using it as an excuse to explore color. And especially like if you look at the background of this work, like, I mean, it's like actually more, I feel like, a study of color than a study of still life. I think that's even made clearer here, where you see this kind of backdrop. And then this was a work that I was very glad to have included in the exhibition, and it kind of differs from the other still lifes, right? So you have like the flowers, which is rendered into dots in this work, and it becomes like an abstraction, you know, already, like an abstraction of color. And how she drew like the vase, the table, the curtains, you know, very minimal, linear, and just suggestive. And really the focus of the work is the explosion of, you know, of color, which is veering onto abstraction. So the second part of the exhibition looks at influence of her travel, and I've titled it, A Philippine Painter Looks at the World. So this was also the same title that she had in a major exhibition that she had in Manila in 1984 at the Museum of Philippine Art, that was curated by Arturo Luz, who later became a national artist, and also ran Luz Gallery, which was really one of the most important galleries of Philippine modernism. And this quote is from Posita, because even though that you know, she learned at Corcoran, at Art Students League, she really felt that travel you know, also was like her teacher in a way. You know, she felt free, and you know, as she said, like, travel gives imagination. You're free of academic constraints. You just paint what you see. And from 1976 to 82, she went to Guatemala, Nepal, Myanmar, Sudan, Haiti, Kenya, and the Dominican Republic. And she and Jack had also moved to Dhaka, Bangladesh for a year, followed by relocations to Bangkok and Boston as well. So Jack's work as an economist on international projects really provided them with the opportunity to travel, and particularly to developing countries. And this exposure to new cultures and people provided Posita with new sources of inspiration. Yeah, so this is Posita painting in Bangkok. Yeah, and this is of Surma Bridge in the city of Sylhet while she was living in Bangladesh. So she exhibited her paintings of Bangladesh in Manila in 1978, and she really wanted to counter the immediate impression of Bangladesh as just a poor country. You know, she wanted to highlight the beauty of the place and its culture. And while she was also in Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic, she painted this young flower vendor while she was doing an artist residency there. And she described her subject that this girl was, you know, selling flowers, and every time the traffic light turned red, she ran to the intersection and begged each driver and passenger to buy flowers. So Posita bought a bucket of flowers from her in order to paint this portrait. And then while she was in Khartoum in Sudan, she also painted this portrait of the Ethiopian refugee Medea, and she noted that Medea just kept shifting poses while she painted her. And then while she was in Thailand, she embarked on this series of Cambodian refugees. And she really firmly believed, as an artist, it's her duty to remind society of its social responsibility. And she was really particularly moved by the Cambodian refugees who fled to Thailand from the conflict at that time in the late 1970s. And she exhibited portraits of them, not only in Bangkok, but also in Boston and Manila, really desiring to call attention to their plight. And she would say that this is actually her most important body of work. And she really wanted it to serve as a reminder that, after the media coverage ends, that these works would keep coming back at you. And I think it's still, well, maybe unfortunately still relevant today, because there's still, a lot of issues with wars and refugees as well. She also drew influence from the art of the Indian poet and philosopher Rabindranath Tagore, the Bangladeshi painter Zainul Abidin, the German artist Keith Kolowitz, and the Norwegian painter Edvard Munch. So these artists painted emotionally charged works with a social consciousness. But years later, when she said of the social and political aspects of her work, she says, "It's the Philippine blood in me." She said, "We fight to live." So I've also included this, which is a painting that she had based on the hand-woven design of breadbasket covers that she bought in the open air market of Omdurman in Sudan during her stay in the country in 1979. She was also very much intrigued by the traditional tribal belief of the evil eye, a malicious glare which can cause misfortune to those who are not protected by the special charms or talismans. And she created at least 2 versions of this work. So one is a painting, it's a traditional oil and canvas that's been framed, but she also made a trapunto, which is in the collection of National Gallery, Singapore. So this was not a part of the exhibition, but I thought it was interesting that it was actually through my research from this show that I realized, she does painting and also trapunto version. So not only this, there's another one that she did of like ati-atihan. It's like a Philippine festival. So there was like there's an iconic picture of her, and then there's like a ati-atihan trapunto in the back. And then later, when I was doing research for the show, I saw there's a painting oil and canvas version. So it's also interesting in how she also goes into abstraction. And then the third section looks at her time in the Philippines when she was based there from 1982 to 1986. And the title of this section comes from a quote from her where she says, "Thus now that I have come home to live in the Philippines after a 12-year absence, I am happy to see my country through the eyes of a painter instead of a politician." And she continued her work in abstraction. So this one, To Fall and Rise Again. So this was part of the Oriental Abstraction. This was part of the Oriental Abstraction series. So at the time, so even though she'd be based in a certain country, it's not like she just stayed there, right? So she'd still keep on traveling. So from Manila, she traveled to Seoul, South Korea, and learned sumukwa, Korean traditional ink brush painting. And this led her to develop the Oriental Abstraction series, which includes this work, To Fall and Rise Again, also known as tipaklong, which means grasshopper in Filipino. And in this series, she uses the image of the rice stalk, and it's like repeated over and over, and utilizing scale, color, composition, and materials to abstract it and make each painting unique. And so what is also interesting about her practice, so she first did this in 1985, exhibiting it in 1986 in Hong Kong, and then she made additions to the work before signing it in 1990. So I think that's also important to know also about her practice, because since I had a very strict period for this exhibition, anything beyond 86 out, like I couldn't include it. And when I learned of this work, it was dated 1990, and then I was like, no, she made this earlier. So sometimes it could actually have then she'll like rework it, sometimes she'll add to it, and then sometimes the later date appears on the work. And we also included this like butterfly trapunto that she did in 1985. And I thought it was very nice to include it because we also included her butterfly from 1976. So that was the year that she had started painting. And I mean, you look at the size, right? So the 1976 butterfly, it's a very small work. And then you can see how much she grew as an artist just in the span of 9 years in this very kind of large trapunto painting. I was also really happy to include this work, Fukuoka Days, which she did when she had traveled to Fukuoka, Japan for an exhibition, and she had used this collaged, she collaged paper she had brought back from her trip and also painted with it. And she said once that art can sometimes be such an expensive business. She said, I think artists should really be creative and use whatever material there is at hand. Right? So she was like open to innovating with what materials were available to her. And also, while she was no longer aiming for a political career, she remained socially and politically engaged as an artist. And so she painted like this girl selling garlands of sampaguita on the plaza outside Quiapo Church in Manila. And so the small white flowers, which is kind of represented by very thickly applied paint, contrast with the girl's tattered clothes. And she actually, I mean, normally she just puts a year to date the work, but actually here she actually dated it Christmas 1984. And she likely wanted to call the attention, like the meaning of the holiday amidst the reality of poverty in Philippine daily life. And she also painted this work, Mendiola, which refers to the street near Malacanang Palace, where the seat of power in the Philippines, where the president lives. Which has been the site of, Mendiola has been the site of numerous demonstrations. And Pasita herself organized rallies with other students in 1969 to protest the fraudulent election under President Ferdinand Marcos. So here she painted a Philippine soldier holding a riot shield and stick, who was ready to beat back any dissenting forces. And she created this work on the 22nd anniversary of the declaration of martial law. So that's when she put the particular date for this work. And she really considered herself a political painter or a painter of an issue. She also painted her friends. I really love this painting, Jerry After Negros, which really became one of our signature images of the show. So this is after a fellow artist, Jerry Arajos. And she painted this after Jerry's trip to Negros to document malnourished children of the Sacadas. So Arajos was a communist and a former guerrilla fighter with the New People's Army. And as a sculptor, he specialized in wood, particularly exploring the human torso as subject. He has been described, so I unfortunately never got to meet Jerry, but a lot of artists, when they talk about him, they always tell me he's a colorful character, right? So I think Pasita tries to capture that. And then Sandra's Mysterious World is of Sandra Palo, who was her close friend and who collaborated together with her in producing videos on Pasita. And Pasita also paid homage to her hometown of Batanes. So she exhibited, she painted Batanes and exhibited the subject in a solo exhibition at the Cultural Center of the Philippines in 1985. Yeah, so these are paintings of people of Batanes and also the landscapes as well. So she said that I was born there and I love that place. Everything is simply hewn out of nature. The hills, the rolling plains, and the sea, all blending together in a stark environment. And she said also something like how much more she could show her love for Batanes than through painting. Okay, so now we can get Matthew's reference to diving in. So this was really an amazing exhibition that Pasita did in 1986, Assaulting the Deep Sea. It was her solo exhibition at Ayala Museum, and this is this really iconic photo of her taken by Wig Tysmans, where she dressed up in scuba gear and posed amidst her installation, paying tribute to the undersea waters of the Philippines. And what really kind of blew my mind, actually what I found out much later was, oh my gosh, as an adult, Pasita didn't, and she grew up in Batanes, okay, she didn't even know how to swim. She didn't know how to swim. I was like, huh, when I read this, I was like, what do you mean? I feel like, as kids, normally it's a rite of life that you have swimming lessons. But yeah, they weren't actually encouraged to learn how to swim. And she only learned as an adult when she was already living in Washington. And so she started with the swimming pool, but she was scared of the sea. I was like, but you live in the island of Batanes, right? And later when she was living in Bangkok, that's when she took up scuba diving, to get over her fear of the ocean, right? So for her to, actually do that, I think that's really completely amazing. And that inspired all of her underwater series of works, including this one, Ligpo Island. Which is this dive site in Batanes. And she portrays a lionfish, which is typically, they're not that big. They're only about 12 to 15 inches in length, but she really paints this on a large scale. I should have included an installation photo here, but it barely fit. It barely fit in the museum. And you can see it's swimming amidst a seascape of vibrant corals in the mouth of a giant clam. And she was really undaunted of making works of such size. And she said in one interview, I never thought of limits. Covering the wall is much better. And I thought I would also mention that in this work, this is the only time that she's made an installation, actually. So apart from covering the walls with her trapuntos that are showing the seas in the Philippines. She also had actually her oriental abstractions as well. They're up there. And then she also had all of these assemblages of sea creatures. And it also had the sound of waves too. And then there was even, you can see some things on the floor. And I think she had sand and shells. So it was really remarkable. It was just really also a one-time event. And I think it would be absolutely wonderful to kind of recreate this, but I think it would be quite a challenge because I think these works have now been dispersed into different collections. Yeah, so this is more from her Assaulting the Deep Sea series. And then she also did smaller paintings also of fishes and underwater life. Yeah, so that's kind of capping off from that exhibition, looking at her years of practice, or her first 10 years of practice. Thank you.
Thank you, Leah. So that was amazing to see for me because in organizing the US show, a lot of the works that we couldn't bring were from Philippine collections. So I haven't seen a lot of these, and it brought up a lot of questions in my mind. We were planning to have a conversation, but I think that we'll move to a Q&A, but I have a question for Lisa. Maybe you might have a question for me. That'll give you some time to think of something if you're curious, and then you can join the circle of conversation. But one thing that was really interesting to me was that we had conversations about identity very frequently about Pasita, especially from my perspective in the United States, where I would get questions like, is she Asian American? Is she Filipino American? Does she consider herself even American? Because she lived everywhere else. So the assertion that she's a Philippine painter is a really strong one to make and an important one to make. And another question that I had was the types of work that you're showing. I can kind of sense these through lines and genres. And I was wondering if there was, since a lot of them come from private collectors, what were the kind of private relationships that collectors might have had with these works? And what does it mean that they were, what does it say about being a Philippine painter, you know?
I feel like those are several questions.
Or you can not answer any of them, or one.
Yeah, I know that assertion of Philippine painter was a strong one, but I think that also kind of speaks to kind of my own experience as well. I mean, I've been based in Singapore now for 13 years, and my sister lives in the U.S. as well, and she moved. I mean, she was already like an adult and working, you know, when she moved. So we grew up in the Philippines, right? And we realized also that our experience, having grown up in the Philippines, is very different as well from Filipinos who grew up entirely abroad. And I guess like for me, like with Pasita, she studied there, right? But I also think that the U.S. Experience was absolutely essential. I mean, this is where she first started. I mean, I think like it wouldn't even have been possible for her to have actually explored it if she hadn't been in the U.S. and at those kind of like critical moments in time. But I think also, I mean, that her Philippine background was also absolutely essential and something that was influential to her practice, like as an artist.
Yeah, like one work I was really jealous that you got to show is Sampaguita Girl.
Which one?
Sampaguita Girl, because it feels so quintessentially like Filipina national, and there's very rarely when the national identity appeared. It was in like a few key works, and that would be one that I would want to show to like my mom, and she would get it immediately, you know.
Yes,
But another thing too is that you know, she lived not only in the United States but in Singapore, and she just seemed to be attracted to this idea of multiculturalism, which is really inherent here. Me being a newbie and being here for the first time, I was like, of course, Pasita would move here and find this place a home.
Yeah, and I think that's really something that's quite remarkable also, like of her practice, that she's just lived in so many places and also like influenced and been influenced by all of these places that she's been to. Yeah.
Well, I think now would be a good time to open it up for questions to the audience, unless you had.
I mean, I do want to ask you as well, just before we open it to the audience, you know, because you've also been working with these remarkable archives of Pasita. So what has been like some of the surprising things that you have found there? Because I think that, I mean, I think really kudos to the Pasita Abad Art Estate, because I think they do make a lot of material available online. Like if you go to their website, there's just so much material. I mean, like it's like an art historian's dream, right? You just, there's like a sign and you're like, oh yay, there's like the article here, article there, click, click, click. But I'm sure there are like so much gems as well that in the archives that are actually not available like online. So I'm quite curious,
like in keeping with the theme of my essay, like in Pain and Joy, it's both an art historian's dream, but it's also can be a nightmare. But like in the best ways, because it's like falling into the deepest rabbit hole that was ever bored, and it's a very loving gesture actually to archive oneself, and it's a show of care, and that you invest into yourself into the future. And Jack, who I also didn't think the estate, thank you Jack and the estate and Christy and Pio and family, are like such amazing stewards of the archive. And the surprising things that I found were just really lovely, mundane things. Like she would embellish everything from dinner menus. They would make Valentine's cards to each other. which is the sweetest
Ooh.
thing. Like, they're not just normal basic Valentines. They were handmade. They were like sexy. They were flirty. They were. They had stamps from all their journeys across the world. I mean, it's exceptional, and it's just not. It's not just paper. It's everything, and it's a kind of beautiful statement that she, as an artist, regarded everything as important, and so nearly everything was archived. So they're currently being acquired by the Asian American Art Initiative at Stanford, where I'm studying, and they are still processing, like over 100 of linear feet of content. So that's all to say is that it's publicly available. The estate really wants this material to be out there, and that I would encourage you to find a path into the work. One thing that came to mind, I think with Vicky, who I love and who has been a great mentor for me, we were thinking about exhibition titles, and the one thing that came to mind was like, well, why don't we name it after a song title? Because there's so many song titles here, and it's a little Easter egg if you're like, oh, that's like Marvin Gaye, and one of them is Always Be My Baby, which bonus points if someone knows who that is, but I was like, we should name the Pasita upon retrospective. Always Be My Baby, which it didn't go through. But I guess like my question to you is like, what would you name, if it was a song title, what would you name your exhibition?
Oh my gosh,
Unless someone else in the audience wants to answer with their favorite song and potential Pasita exhibition. I see, over here.
Hi, thank you so much for the discussion about Pasita. My question is, when she started out as an artist, did she have a patron of sorts that kind of supports her, either individual, family, or a corporation, which will kind of like guarantees an income or sales of her work?
I mean, it's a good question. I think really she was very much supported by Jack. Supported by Jack. I think, but he was always, I think. I mean, if you know Jack, and we say this very fondly, I think he was always like pushing her and encouraging her, and wanting her also to be produced. And I think that reflects like how incredibly prolific she is. I mean, she produced like thousands of work in her short lifetime. And eventually, the patronage also came. I think primarily Philippines. And I think what was kind of the game changer was when the Museum of Contemporary Art and Design did an exhibition on Pusita. So this was curated by Pio Abad and Joselina Yeye Cruz. And I think that's what's actually led to really much more of a global and international appreciation of Pusita in the last, 8 years. Yeah.
Yeah, to add to that, I mean, a lot of these works were not collected until recently, which is indicative that people didn't take her as seriously until now. And there were key loans from exhibitions, but Lisa's right in that it really was this really, very much of her practice is also a charting of her relationship of love to both the world and also to her lover, Jack, and the stewardship of the archive is so indicative of that, is that you care for someone not just when they're alive and embodied, but when they're scattered amongst letters and papers and fabric and buttons and sequins and glitter and everything.
there were, she also had family and friends, like who also bought her work. So I also contacted a number of them to try to find the works for this exhibition. Yeah.
Did anybody get the "Always Be My Baby" reference? Okay, 'cause that
Did you say Mariah? Is it Mariah? Thank you for a very interesting introduction to Pasita. I think like I first discovered her when I was in the U.S. So I'm Singaporean, Filipino, and I was in the U.S. and there was an exhibit, and I wasn't sure if she was a Filipino artist or an American artist or a Filipino-American artist. And then when I went back to the Philippines, there was another, I missed all of her exhibits, so I'm very grateful to be in Singapore and catch this. But I guess my question is, I guess for both of you, but mostly for you, Matthew, like is your first time in Asia, and having studied the work of Pasita as Filipino-American, how, and with Pasita identifying as a political painter, like how do you connect with the politics of her work, if that makes sense?
Oh, that's very soul-searching. No, I mean, there's one series that was not talked about in depth tonight, which is the Immigrant Experience series. It was a really short period in which it was very bound in the distinctly Filipino-American experience. And the work that really comes to mind that envelops the politics of it was that when I was at the Walker, there's one work called I Thought the Streets Were Paved with Gold, which has this vignette of all of these laborers, from a caretaker, a homemaker, someone wearing I think an electrician, but it stems from this idea that the American dream offers everybody this equal experience of opportunity. And she has this amazing quote that she references from Ellis Island, which was like, when I came to United States, the streets were not paved with gold. In fact, they weren't paved at all, and I had to do the paving. But what is actually tying it to my own background is that I felt this way in museums and in the art world, right? Like, who is paving? When I go to SFO, the Filipino Americans are working hospitality, service. Filipino Americans or Filipinos, or that specific accent comes through when you call, global telecoms companies in the call center, and you get the sense that like the Philippine body is running global telecom, and it's like there's a kind of rage in that because it's so hidden and underneath, and it's layered with decades of imperial relationship with Filipinos working in maritime trade as service, the nursing industry, and my own mom was a nurse. So we had very little representation of Filipino nurses, Filipino-American nurses in art museums. And it was so surreal to hang a work in this hallowed museum that has a reputation for minimalism and conceptual art. There's a Filipino nurse hung right, and also one of her most shady pieces of political shade, which is Marcos and his cronies, was being hung in the Midwest in a gallery, just as the political landscape was shifting back again in a time that resembled really closely to where Pasita was, at a time when Pasita was living. Well, is there any remaining questions? Well, I guess as a final word, I'll offer a memory. I think that being with the bridge is really meaningful. Again, it only existed to me flatly as an image, but today I saw someone like putting your hands up and like almost embracing it. And it's just this continuous font of joy that I had never thought that I'd be able to experience. I never thought I'd be able to travel the way that I grew up. So thank you, STPI and Lisa. And you have any last words?
Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us on a Friday night to be here. And yes, thank you to STPI for inviting me and Matthew. And Matthew, I really enjoyed your presentation and being in conversation with you. It's great. Yeah.